Black coffee.
This is the Exchange Coffee Podcasting Network, where coffee people talk to coffee people about coffee and things coffee adjacent. This episode of X-Files is brought to you by Kavoya Specialty Coffee, where coffee is always a collaborative voyage. Welcome to the X-Files, podcast from the past with Mark Inman and Todd Mackey. Down the stairs, around the corner, down the long hall, and through the double doors, you'll find the archives for the Exchange Coffee Podcast, episodes from 2018 and 2019, before we had a studio. We're going back through the archives and improving the sound quality where we can, re-recording introductions, and merging two-part episodes into a single episode. Episode 3 of the X-Files is from episodes 6 and 7 of the Exchange from September 2018, Cupping and Quality Control Basics. Note, this is also before I learned to duct tape Mark and Todd's arms to their sides during recordings because they gesture a lot and you can hear them hitting the table. And now, here they are, from 2018 when they didn't know how microphones worked, Mark and Todd.
Tonight, we're going to be unpacking QA, quality assurance, quality control. And I'm excited for this one. This is a part of what we do, having worked full time in the lab in my past. And, you know, obviously a huge part of trading is, you know, cupping and being close to quality management. But I'm sure you feel the same. I guess to kick it off and to just dive right in, I thought it might be good to kind of give a wrap on, you know, what is QA and why it matters. You know, you can give us good insights from your days from the roasting side, Mark, and we can certainly talk about what it means for Olam Specialty Coffee.
Well, I guess I'll get started. Quality assurance or quality control from a roasting standpoint, I think plays two crucial roles. One is it's a tool to help you buy coffee and regulate the coffees that you're buying, keep them in check throughout the year. And secondly, it's to evaluate coffees that you're going to be selling, and that could be through production roasting and therefore cupping, also to come up with marketing terminology for that coffee. I think that in that scenario, in both scenarios, they're serving two different purposes and have to be looked at two different ways when you're evaluating coffees in that manner. But from a buying perspective, it's key. I think what makes me nervous as a trader is when I have clients tell me, I want to buy the best Colombian. What do you got? And the question is, the best for what? And how are you using it? And then they said, well, I'll just trust your opinion. And which that to me is a very, very scary road to go down. Not that there's any problem with trusting my opinion, but I'm not your company. I don't necessarily know what you're going to be doing with that coffee, how you're going to roast it, what type of machine you're roasting on, what you're actually looking for in the profile. And it's necessary that that person learns how to cup. And usually it comes from they're new or they're inexperienced and they don't want to admit they don't know how to do it, which I have always felt rather silly because we all started that way. And there should be no shame in saying, hey, what's the best way to set up a quality control program, or how do you do it? You know, I'm just entering this and being okay with that, rather than just asking me to build your entire product line for you and hope that, you know, my tastes match yours.
Sure. Yeah. At the end of the day, I mean, I've always said, you know, partially joking, but rooted in seriousness, that there is no best, right? I mean, we're talking about target, not target in so many cases, even in the upper tier of quality. You know, so when we get into quality assurance, quality control, these different, you know, pinch points, if you will, throughout, you know, a roaster's process, purchasing through distribution, you know, we really have different considerations to make, you know, depending on where they are, who they're selling to, what kinds of economic pressures on the purchasing side or on the sales side exist, and so on and so forth. So, you know, it's not as easy as, well, you know, what tickled you pink at the cupping table, as much as, you know, you're talking about, well, what's the most appropriate, you know, business decision here. You know, that said, you know, being able to create a program where you can define quality tiers and what works for those profiles, avatars, and or sort of quality levels can be super helpful when you can build that calibration slowly, surely over time, with your traders, people that you're doing business with, both, here in the U.S., if you're based here or, wherever you're located, all the way through to the origin countries you're sourcing from. Obviously, it's critical. It's interesting, thinking about why quality matters so much. I mean, we've already sort of gotten into it over the course of the last 5 episodes. When we talk about managing quality, communicating quality, blending for quality, restricting quality for the sake of value, all of these different things. But, here we obviously want to take a more practical approach and actually talk about, where do you start? Say your, first day on the job. What's the very most basic setup in terms of creating a lab? And, where would you recommend someone to begin? Sure. Whether as a roaster or someone who's working, even at origin, trying to set up a more primitive lab that can really get the basics done. I mean, what do you think are the most critical pieces, both in material and practice, day one?
Well, I think the biggest pieces of equipment, obviously, are the roaster and the grinder. Everything else is relatively inexpensive to put together. And I think that's the one area where a lot of roasters have a hard time spending the amount of money that you need to spend on that equipment. They spend a lot of money on their production roaster, vans, and espresso machine for your lab, and then they get around to the sample roaster and they are like, oh my gosh, what can I buy that saves me money? And I don't think you necessarily have to go crazy and buy a top of the line roaster. But I do think you need to buy a roaster that's appropriate for the amount of samples you're going to be tasting each week. I also think that the roaster itself needs to mimic the production roaster that you have. So if you're roasting on a hybrid roaster like a Loring, a fluid roaster like a Niehaus Neotech, or a drum roaster, the sample roaster should mirror that type of roasting style. It doesn't make a lot of sense to have a hybrid roaster like a Loring and then have a drum roaster like a Probat, because the taste is going to be very different. And I get that question a lot from folks. Like, I'm buying this machine, what type of roaster? And they're often surprised at the suggestions I give for equipment, because they're expecting to hear, your typical barrel roasters that are out there on the market, and that may not be appropriate for the type of machine they have. As far as grinders go, I think you could get away with any basic workhorse grinder as long as it's accurate in its grinding. I don't think you need to get a very, very high quality precision grinder, because you're not doing espresso. So a lot of the workhorse brands that are out there, Bunn, for example, the G2 is a great classic workhorse grinder, and with the burrs that will last a very long time. And obviously you can go up from there, and to me, in that particular situation, it's not necessary. As long as the grinder's clean and the burrs are sharp, it's going to work just fine. And then depending on the protocol that you like to use for your cupping, either the SCAA form or the Cup of Excellence form, a lot of people like to use. It doesn't really matter. I used to use back in the day a Colombian Coffee Federation quick form. I thought that was quite useful. I think that part just depends on what your style is, as long as you're being consistent with that style.
Sure. Yeah, and I mean, name of the game with equipment is maintenance, right? So
absolutely,
so much of having good equipment is maintaining good working order for this stuff. Like you mentioned with the Bunn grinder being a perfectly respectable tool, classic, price accessible, and if it's maintained, it's just gonna crush for you, week after week, month after month.
Yeah.
One thing I didn't hear you mention, which is interesting, and maybe just an oversight. I know as the years go on, these things kind of trickle out, but
yeah.
But like water treatment, I didn't hear you mention anything about dealing with water. What are your thoughts on that? Do you feel like, I know it's one of the, obviously paramount in terms of how it affects coffee's profile and taste. But one of those things that, some people care about, some people don't. Some people actually look at it, more like winemakers, brewers, distillers might, where, water is actually sort of a part of, the inherent unique qualities of how they might choose and then present their coffees and wherever they're located. What do you think from a lab standpoint, the basic threshold should be for water quality?
Well, I think in your lab, your water should be filtered. I mean, I'm hoping that your water line running into the building has a good filtration system that's appropriate for brewing coffee, because you also have the espresso machine to deal with as well. I think that if you don't have a large roasting warehouse, or if you're roasting in a small warehouse or your garage, just good filtered water will get you by. I don't think you should. I knew people that were mixing distilled water and filtered water. I've never really understood the logic behind that. You can go as crazy as doing I'm trying to think of the product that's out now. It's like
Third Wave Water.
Yeah, Third Wave Water.
Or Global Customized Water does a remineralization packet as well, and they've done that for a long time.
Yeah, you can go that route, but I think a good filtered water will get you by just fine. When you travel to origin, I mean, filtered water is, bottled water is about as good as it's going to get. And the reality is that most of your consumers that are going to be brewing this product, especially when you're talking about production cupping here, they're not going to be using necessarily good filtered water or treated water. And so you need to also taste the coffee from that standpoint as well. If you live, if you're selling your coffee in your market, you might want a cup using the tap water every once in a while, just so you understand how a good portion of your clients are going to actually be experiencing that coffee. I think it's great to work in a vacuum, but it's also important, and also I've always, been a proponent of production brewing, where you brew and taste with cream, with sugar, as well as black, because most people are drinking coffee with cream and sugar, and you want to see how that coffee reacts in that environment as well.
Sure. Yeah, no, I mean, we should note, just for those who might be setting up a more elaborate lab, which, ultimately a few years down the road, to have a good espresso setup, nice equipment for brewing coffee a myriad of ways, exactly how you might put it out over the bar in your cafe, or how you might, sort of hope and aspire to have your wholesale customers brew it. If you're going to be hooking up equipment like this, you certainly want, at bare minimum, to have a nice particulate filter.
Without a doubt,
for things like Jeeklers that are going to, take a grain of sand that's in the water, and all of a sudden you have an obstruction in the flow restriction, that pressurizes the machine. So, obviously a big thing there. I know in the Northeast we have high chloride content in the water, just given the proximity to the ocean and the stone out here, and treating that is good for longevity for espresso machines and hot water boilers alike. So that's something good. But I tend to agree with you. I know, there's long been a lab standard, by the association that, sort of says, well, here's the perfect water, by total dissolved solids. But, ultimately we're not specifying really what the composition of those solids is. And that's where, the real impact on flavor is. So a basic approach, clean, odor-free, clear water, that's a great place to start, I feel like.
Yeah.
Right on. So, I mean, obviously we jumped in and to sort of zoom out for a moment, we're talking right out of the gate. The most important thing to do is to be able to roast samples, understand the effects of whatever roasting process or equipment that you do choose for your sampling has on the flavor profile. And then, of course, all for the purpose of cupping, right? You're roasting as sort of a precursor to the cupping process.
Yep.
Clearly, we're saying with that cupping is the most important sorting in the quality process for the purpose of specialty coffee. Would you agree? And for you, what is cupping meant, I guess? There's a lot of people out there, who struggle to find the time to cup, or don't have maybe the the space allocated in their roastery to, either really evaluate the coffees that they're buying before they pick them up, which we can certainly support on, but also, they're not getting to cup or taste, brew, adulterate, taste all ways the coffees that they're putting out to their guests and customers. I guess I'd be curious to hear sort of your full rundown on how important you feel like cupping as a process is to, the business around specialty coffee.
I mean, it's paramount. It would be like having a restaurant and not tasting your own food, or, winemakers not tasting their wines. You just can't produce and pump it out there. It would be a complete crapshoot on your end. Because lots of things happen in coffee that just are a part of the process. I mean, potato defect, is a prime example. It happens even if the samples, the pre-ship samples, the arrival samples cup totally clean. You can have that one, weird little bean that gets in there and affects a batch. And if you're not picking that up in your production cupping, you're putting out an extremely inferior product that may be falling into the hands of the next great client you want, or the next, group of customers that you're really wanting to lure. You could also taste when coffees are starting to fade or get tired, or understand the life cycle of it. For me, cuppings, it needs to be a priority in your business just as much as your roasting facility in general. Your production facility needs to be there. It's a tool for buying. It's a tool when you get into blending coffee. It's a tool for your production, the life cycle of the coffee. And it's also a key tool for education of your customers. I think that if you've ever done educational cuppings, customers love it. It's an absolute treat for them. It's an exercise that they don't get in other aspects of their life. And it shows them that you're very serious about what you do, that this is something that has science behind it. It is not purely an artistic pursuit. There are, I love the moment of education where people say, well, I don't really have a palate. I don't know good coffee from bad, or I can't, this idea of, lemon notes or berry that I hear, I'll never taste that. And to prove them wrong within an hour and show them, oh, wow, that is what berry tastes like. And oh, that is this lemon that they're talking about. And opening their minds, it makes them fans of you permanently. And it's much more powerful than an advertisement or a demo in a store. It's much more personal, but it gets you that long-term client that we all desperately want in the coffee industry.
Sure. Yeah, it's funny. I always go back to this saying that was shared with me, what feels like my first day in the door in specialty coffee. And it was learn to cup, then cup to learn. And I feel like for me, that's always been a truth. Right. So many of the hypotheses that, the things I'm thinking, the things I'm curious about, I've been able to essentially apply scientific method by isolating one variable, one question at the cupping table. Right. Is this coffee different because of its variety? Is this coffee different because of its roast profile? Is this coffee different because, the aspect of, where the farm sits in this particular, mountain range, for example? All of these questions can be answered from a sensory standpoint at the cupping table, which allows you to be a student. But of course, to your point, all of a sudden you're opening up this opportunity for people who, might be a little further behind you on the road to have doors open for them as well. You're kind of making a way for people to have the light bulb turned on, which is incredibly transformative and becomes endearing, indefinitely, which is awesome.
Sure.
So yeah, my recommendation with a lab is always, when someone is building out a roastery, even a really simple, I think of like, the first spot any roaster has, some garage door, walk up type of, 1,000 square feet, if that. And, and they're trying to think about, how to have a lab or, how to have somewhere that they can actually taste their coffees. Right. My recommendation is always, you need that space. Make it easy to cup. Right. Make it easy to cup, because if it's not easy, you're not going to do it. And, so if, you have a break table and that doubles as your desk and that doubles as the packing table, and, to cup once a week, you've got to clear that thing off of, 6 inches of papers and materials and all that kind of stuff.
Right.
It's quickly going to fall out the bottom. You're not going to be checking in on your finished roasted coffee qualities. Mm-hmm. You're going to find it really hard to sustain having a regular sampling program when push comes to shove. And like any small business owner, you're just, burning the candle at both ends to get things done day to day. That extra effort is not going to come out, or it's certainly going to be, a begrudging task. So make the process of cupping, give it a place, make it easy, make it enjoyable, because, I agree, it's totally central.
Yeah, absolutely. And it could be as simple as, a sheet of plywood and sawhorses. When you're done roasting, you set it up and you do it when it's quiet in the warehouse, and you get people involved. It does have to be something that is easy, clean, inviting. It can't be a hassle to get to. If it's in the corner, with all your other stuff, you're gonna overlook it, and you're going to make excuses not to do it every day, and it will be a crucial mistake if you don't do that.
Yeah, and I think of how non-romantic cupping once is, but once you gather, like any data collection, right? There's no romance at all until you have a bank of information that you can see themes in, right? Yeah. So if you can't cup and have it be a part of essentially the process, and the schedule week to week, you're never going to have enough data to stand back and actually make decisions on, to see how products trend and how your process affects your product, and what you're, opening the doors for and sending out, once it's done. But to that point, and to kind of shift the touch, mm-hmm. when you're thinking small company, just getting started, I mean, what is an appropriate kind of, amount of cupping? How, when would you say, how would you say to approach cupping? How often, mm-hmm. When to schedule it in? I mean, any pointers that you typically give for something like that?
Well, if you're cupping for buying, it's when you have leeway, some time prior to the need of coffee. So if it's spot coffee you're buying, you have a time to at least a week ahead to cup all of the samples that you get to make that fill. If it's something you're buying from origin to ship and to arrive, you need to give yourself a significant window of time to get that done. If you're doing it for blending purposes, how you're going to do that, that would be, I like to do that in a team exercise, to have a handful of people involved in that. Because the feedback, the input is important. And production cupping should be happening at least once a day, at least once a day to at least once a week to cup your production roast. It can be spot checking if you want to, but I think that if you have the ability to do so, it should be every batch that goes out, specifically to check consistency of that product, as well as spotting any defects that may come through that are taste defects that you're not going to see. That to me is a crucial one, because some of these defects are nasty, and they will affect your reputation if you don't catch them.
For sure. Let's say you're a real, simple operation today. You roast, mm-hmm. let's say 2 days a week. Let's say your production is Monday and Wednesday. You're shipping on Tuesday and Thursday. Where do you see a production cupping protocol, chronologically in that process? Where do you see that happening? For the Monday coffees, is it first thing Tuesday morning before everything gets packed, or is everything packed? If everything is packed on Monday afternoon, you've pulled samples, and before things leave Tuesday, you're essentially allowing yourself, a moment to pull coffees back if there's something actionable on the table. Is it something more nuanced where come week's end, you cup everything and you cross your fingers that you don't find anything and have to call to explain before customer X breaks into a bag? Or what do you think?
Yeah, I mean, in a perfect world, you're roasting on Monday, cupping Tuesday morning, starting your packing right after the coffee's past muster. I think that's great. maybe leave Fridays for your buying coffees you're looking at. If you're buying weekly, or if you're buying monthly, at least allowing one day a week that's solely for the purpose of buying coffee cupping. And, on the production side, that's also a good window to do cupping for marketing purposes, which, again, is a different purpose, and different language should be used in that type of cupping. But you could, at that point, make additional notes that I, personally feel don't belong on a normal evaluation form.
And to that, you're talking about essentially descriptors that are
language.
Wooing
I'm a big stickler. I'll give you my little rant here. I was going to save this for later, but it's like the whole time you've been talking, it's been gnawing at me. I'm going to, and this is, this isn't the wine talking yet, but it might be a precursor to that. We, meaning the industry, has created a clear set of language to communicate the attributes of coffee, and that's the SCA cupping wheel. That we've had for, there's an updated one now, but we've had it for a long time. Similar to the Davis wine wheel for those people who have heard of that before. But it's a list of aromas and taste and defects and qualities within coffee. But it's a specific set of language that should be universal. So when you're traveling to El Salvador and you're cupping with people there, they're using that as a tool, and that tool should be used by you. And what I have seen in the past, which drove me up the wall and still drives me up the wall today, I'll give you an example of two cuppers. I'm not going to say who they are, but there's people that they're contemporaries of mine, aka fellow old people. But this was at a time when, all of the buyers were trying to really up this whole Indiana Jones image or like tortured artist image as a coffee buyer. And we were at a COE event, and there, if you've ever been to a Cup of Excellence event, you go, evaluate the coffees, you do your form, and then you meet in a room and you go through what you experienced and how you cupped. And you're in a room with cuppers from all over the United States, as well as the country that you're working in. So you have the national cuppers from, whatever country you're cupping in, and usually a handful of foreign cuppers. So it could be Japanese cuppers and European cuppers. And the language is the form. Or the wheel. That's what people are using. And during this era, which is probably one of the most nauseating eras in coffee, I had one cupper who would say, he was on this whole like Jim Morrison kick where it was, this coffee tastes like a 78 Firebird, with worn out vinyl seats, and
no, that can't be true.
And you see the national cuppers like, wait a minute, what's he saying? And they're trying to, ask the question like, what do you mean by vinyl seats? Like, is that the taste of like petroleum, or no, like the worn out seats with a little character, but they just, they just have a little bit of soul in them. And then we get to another coffee, and it would be this one. He was on this whole auto kick. This one is a 71 Capri, just bad engine and just leaks oil and, not up to par. And you could just see the cuppers from, not only the country, but from other countries like, Europe and Japan, just throwing up their arms like, what in the hell is this person talking about? And the whole goal was, I have more of a palate than you do, and I'm tasting from an abstract artistic perspective, where you're dealing with these pedestrian comments, and it came off as annoying. And the other thing that annoyed me, or got me was. This coffee has this distinct note of this peach that was grown on my grandmother's farm on this area in South Carolina. And it's like, we could all relate to that. That's a great universal note that we should all write down, because we've all been to your grandmother's farm and have tasted that peach. Luckily, I believe that time has passed and we're not doing that anymore. But my strong feeling is, when you're cupping for evaluation purposes, for buying purposes, for competition purposes, stick to the wheel, because it's the language that we should all relate to. Now, when you go back and you roast for the public, I mean, go nuts, because then you're setting the tone for what your coffee's talking about. And it doesn't have to follow any rules, and can get as esoteric and avant-garde as are those two examples I gave, because that's entertaining to customers and is endearing and will feed that mystique of this buyer is, really, he's an artist and he's, cutting through the jungle and, discovering the hidden gems of the world. You feed that whole fantasy. But in a industry setting or a professional setting, you're not doing a service to anybody by using those descriptors because they're not relatable.
Yeah, no, there's a time and a place for point of view when you get into actually creating your why and messaging outwards to, your consumer.
Right.
You can easily, you describe every coffee that you're selling as a certain car with a certain interior and a certain, lingering smell or, a certain vibe or music.
Well, and if,
through.
For that example, if you're selling to auto heads, I mean, I saw this really cool packaging recently. It looks like a paint thinner can, and it has each label was a car. It was a Le Mans car or a stock car. Somebody posted it on social media, and if you want to go nuts with car themes and you're speaking to car people, have at it, man. I mean, that's really cool. But when you're in Peru and you're having a farmer or a QC person at a mill trying to understand the language to be on the same page with you, to sell you coffee or to get feedback, that's not helping anyone to do that.
Sure. I love, I'm sorry to riff on the whole auto marketing thing, but those like that can style that's like carburetor cleaner or something. It's almost like a tapered can. That could be cool. I haven't seen anything like that, but
for sure,
someone's got to take that gem and make something out of it. But the bottom line here, just to land the plane, is those marketing cuppings should be their own thing. It's almost like its own isolated variable, saying, okay, how are we going to sell this coffee is the question, instead of, are we going to sell this coffee, or are we going to buy this coffee, or is this coffee tasting how it should? Right. And I think that's entirely appropriate, but regardless of where anybody, comes down on the question of like, well, do, really poetic or esoteric descriptors, are they helping or hurting when it comes to marketing? I think that there's a lot of justification for saying one and or the other. Companies that market on, the color of a particular package for a product. There's companies that market on a description, and there's room for both. Maybe you cup those Fridays to determine what color goes with it. Maybe you cup to determine how you describe it and sell it. Maybe you do both. But either way, it shouldn't be something that's intermixed with like your purchasing decisions or,
Oh, no, definitely not. And I think you do need to be careful, though, about being too crazy with your language on your packaging, because if it's not relatable, if it's something that the end consumer is saying, I'm not getting those qualities at all, then they're going to feel like, well, I'm wasting my money because I'm not picking up the attributes that I'm supposed to be picking up, and I'm spending a premium. So maybe I'm better off buying a cheaper coffee because I can taste those attributes. It's simpler.
Yeah.
And so you have to have a couple of those notes where someone's like, I actually do taste that. That's that. Yeah, I got it. And then that marketing's working beautifully.
Sure.
But if you go too nuts, I mean, I've seen some packages that are outright ludicrous, and not everybody is a registered silver palate out there. And so I would say be relatable as possible.
Yeah, no, more people are going to feel confident and have a good experience when they say, wow, this is coffee. I taste coffee, than when they read, lavender and elderflower, and they're like, oh, I taste coffee. the only thing better than a great description is when that great description matches the cup, because that's what's going to really endear someone. In the Northeast, we still see a lot of consumers, when they see this type of description on a package, we still see people, curious if there's some adulterant in it, some flavoring. So, it's...
that still happens out here too.
Yeah,
it's when
crazy.
You say chocolatey, they're like, what is this like? Does this have chocolate flavoring in it? No. That's not... And if you're hearing that a lot, then it's time to eliminate that off your package.
Yeah, for sure. It's a fun digression we're making, but let's get back to quality assurance, quality control. This is, the marketing thing is not a small piece of it. I mean, it's a huge piece, being that it's the prevailing message that goes out for any company. At least it better be going out to the majority of people who they engage with. Right. But beyond that, getting back to the lab, and as companies grow, one huge aspect of quality that we have not, touched on in the slightest thus far is, physical analysis, which, when you're starting as a young company, really bootstrapping it, a lot of this equipment can be price prohibitive. The sense of importance to a lot of young upstart companies to spend the money to really outfit a green coffee lab with these tools. The sense of importance isn't there yet. But as they level up, there's a lot of physical aspects that are monitored by, larger, more complex companies. There's good reason there. I guess, what is your recommendation, and what do you recommend as a way to start with this? What are your biggest recommendations against certain approaches, potentially negative that physical specs can run into? And then, how would you suggest, to what level for a small to mid-sized roaster would you suggest, really investing in this side of your quality assurance program?
Sure. Well, I'll start from the best to the more superfluous, and we'll take it in that direction. I think the first and foremost is a sorting mat, a black mat or a black piece of paper, and a defect book. I don't think enough buyers or QC people actually physically grade coffee as much as they should. That to me is one of the most powerful tools in negotiating price, because maybe the grade is not what you have been told it is, or you think it is, and you can negotiate price down or spot massive problems with a lot of coffee. That is a very simple investment of a defect handbook and a large black mat, and physically going through the samples and pulling out defects one by one.
Yeah, you're talking not even $50 USD.
No, nothing.
Not even.
But you should be doing it, especially if you're buying in quantity, because, again, this is the largest expenditure you're going to be in charge of in your company, and you want to make sure you're actually buying what you're being told is available. And or if you are noticing that certain origins their defect count is much higher, and you don't really like that, maybe it's an origin you don't need in your lineup. There's a tradition of, well, these are kind of funky by nature, and that's just how it is, and that doesn't mean you have to necessarily play in that arena if you don't want to. I think the second tool that is important is a moisture meter, although I don't think it's crucial initially. I think it does help, especially from the if you're buying at origin, so you're getting a pre-ship sample and then you're getting a landed sample, that the coffee is not nosediving in moisture, or doesn't come in with extremely high moisture where mold can be an issue. I don't think that that's something right away is necessary. If you have it, it's great. It's great to have. It's a wonderful tool. Most importers will measure that for you. There's no vested interest in them not to be perfectly upfront with the moisture content. It's not a huge expense. You're talking about $400, I think, for a decent moisture meter. That'll work. Color analyzers, there's a handful of brands out there. I think those are great if you're roasting in very, very large volumes for very, very large clients. that need you to hit a certain spec, a roast color spec over and over and over again. And your profitability is based on not losing extra moisture that you don't need to lose. It's an extremely expensive investment. I don't necessarily think it's a worthwhile one for most of the people listening to this podcast. I've never seen a need for it as a roaster, but I've never really worked for a massive roasting company, so I don't know. I've never had one. You can get by with color tiles and things like that. Other than that, you're talking again, roaster, your grinder, your spoons, your cups, your forms. I don't know any other hardware that I would think are necessary. Todd, do you have ones that you're thinking about specifically?
Yeah. No, I mean, I think a couple of tools for a roaster that really, from a quality standpoint, can take you, leaps and bounds further. I mean, one very basic is just having a 500 ml graduated cylinder and scale where you can, be monitoring the density of the coffees you're being offered, you're picking up, and that you're roasting. Because, right. This is just like batch size control is going to be one of the largest sort of prevailing aspects as to how you might approach a coffee in the roaster. So you're talking, even less money, really, you probably already, if you're cupping, you already have the good scale, that goes to 1/10 or 100th of a gram. To get a plastic graduated cylinder on Amazon.com is almost nothing. I mean, you're talking about less than what it would cost you to get a grading book and a black sheet or a black mat or, whatever works.
Sure.
And this is going to be the type of thing for me that, is going to be a guiding light, when it comes to setting an expectation for, profiling a coffee before you even drop a batch. Other than that, I think that in my opinion, we're seeing profiling software a la Cropster and others, as a way that, some of the finish roasted, tools like a color meter, Agtron, Javalytics, we're seeing control of process more integrated and more attentively followed. And I think it's not only a substitution for something binary like color, is it in this range or out, but it's also something that you can, with, analyzing finished colors, you can hit a variety of profiles at the same finished color, whether whole bean or ground, for a given coffee. And so, that doesn't necessarily answer the question when we're in specialty with finished quality as really like the prevailing value proposition that justifies, the added premium that we're asking for and we're ultimately delivering upstream. So I think that those do, kind of prevail in my mind as the right first step. If you have a large industrial roaster and, you'll see this in, large industrial commercialized roasting companies where they might have, Agtron color meters at, 3 or 4 different specific points in their process, where a coffee's pulled from the silo immediately post roast. It's measured on, once it's ground, it's pulled, before it's packaged, and then it's pulled, both leaving the warehouse and maybe even pulled, and third party is auditing the finished roasted color from a distributor's warehouse. So, you see this can be really complex. Moisture would be another part of that. But I do think for, small to mid-sized specialty roasters, process control can really remove the need for some of that, really cost prohibitive hardware, while also increasing the capacity to control, the sensory aspects of the coffee, which ultimately matter to the space that they're sitting in much, much more. The only thing otherwise, which it's not a tool by any stretch, but it's certainly a philosophy that when it comes to, physical quality, needs to be applied, is that you just have to be reasonable when you're creating specifications. it's fine and good. And I don't know if you've run into this, but I've definitely had customers come to me and say, well, I need a coffee that cups 85 plus, but it needs to be, 11.1 to 11.3 moisture. It has to be, this color, this defect inventory, this particular density. Another that we haven't touched on, we can get into, is water activity, which is, the measure of respiration or free humidity, also related to shelf stability and the longevity of a freshness of a coffee, as well as, the stability in shipment. But ultimately you can lay those out, but at a point, someone in my position is going to say, well, I can't sell you that. A, because maybe I don't physically have it, but B, because Origin won't deliver those specs.
You can't guarantee that they can. Yeah,
exactly. Deliver. I mean, maybe there's a price at which they could. But, more often than not, you're talking about, something that's unrealistic that most sellers are going to scoff at and say that's really not a possibility, even when coffee is cared for at the very upper reaches. And so, have that type of sober approach where, what matters when you monitor the physicals around your green and your finished roasted coffee, and create a spec for both if you're outfitted to do so, that is realistic and that does actually have its limits at places that are, quote unquote, actionable, where, cool, if a coffee falls out of this moisture, I don't want it because it's not going to be workable, or, similar, that kind of thing.
Yeah.
I don't know. Have you done much with water activity? I know, there's a lot of open areas of study. I know a lot of folks also looking at and monitoring, coffees under black light for inconsistency and taking really detailed physical notes there. But obviously, there's still a lot to be learned. I mean, these are metrics that have only really started to be looked at in recent years, and the amount of data is still mounting. Curious.
Yeah, I have customers who've tested the water activity. That was a little bit after my time as a roaster, so I wasn't really involved in measuring that, but do have clients today that do that.
For sure. Well, getting into, we kind of got into calibration with the industry in, your extreme frustration with, the over marketing of coffee during professional cuppings, when we should be scoring, calibrating, and working in a more collaborative way, with our industry peers. But I guess, a good sort of closing segment, maybe segment is an understatement on, how long we could riff on this, but the way to kind of bring things, to a close, we're talking about cupping, we're talking about, physical QA, process around creating a meaningful, marketing strategy around describing coffee. All of these things are a part of how we cup coffee, and the sort of respiration of any given roasting company's QA QC process. But, let's say you're a relatively young, roaster in the scene. You are excited to be cupping coffees. You've built a space that's comfortable. It encourages you to get in there. You're cupping regularly. But, you're part of a small team. You're looking for ways to build yourself up to agree more and or calibrate with, the industry around you that you're a part of. What are the best ways that you in your experience have done so, ways that you constantly find yourself encouraging new folks to the coffee business to get involved, and, anecdotal stories or, things you've learned over time as to, how to approach that idea of appraising coffees, accurately calibrating with your peers. Take it away.
Well, I think, attending as many like Roasters Guild retreats, if you can get into COE jury, that's important. If you could judge a good food awards event, all of those, any exposure to your peer group in cupping is a good thing. I know that for many, it's intimidating, but don't let that stuff get in your head. This is about cupping with your peers, evaluating coffees together, understanding how other people use language to describe coffees, things that they're picking up that you may not be picking up. That was always a huge learning lesson for me. Things that people were finding or issues that they were having. Like I learned a long time ago I would cup the coffees on the first round, maybe go around a second round, but there were people that were going 3-4 times around the table, and they were reporting how that coffee changes as it cools and what they were experiencing. And that opened my eyes to, I need to be a little bit more patient on the table. I need to spend more time going through that coffee, not just blasting through it, getting my initial impressions and thinking that that's all that matters. That this coffee is dynamic and it's changing as it cools. And as a seller, am I selling, coffee through a drive-through where the client is in the car and drinking that coffee over their commute where the coffee is going to get cool? Or am I just doing an espresso bar where people pop up and do a shot and walk away, and it doesn't matter what that coffee tastes like as it cools? Those are the things that I think are important to learn about. I think doing things like the Q grading course is important professionally and just personally to stretch your knowledge about cupping and cupping protocol and how to evaluate coffees in different formats. I don't think that there's anything that is a bad idea. I think where things become problematic is when you get your ego involved and you're trying to sell yourself as somebody with superhuman powers at the cupping table. Everybody can taste. It's like a muscle. If you want to run a marathon, or if you want to be good at CrossFit, the way to do it is just to do it a lot. That's the only secret. Nobody has some, magic secret talent. So don't get sucked in by that. And it's just practice, practice, practice. If you find peers in the coffee industry that are friends of yours and they're not necessarily competitors, having a weekly Skype cupping session where you guys send each other coffees and you cup them and then you get together and talk about them. I think all of that stuff is very positive, and the more you can do it, or how do you market it once you've got it? Once you've evaluated the coffee for purchasing, what's the successful language for selling that coffee? I think that's where you get to have a little more fun and be a little more loose. But there's certainly language that works and language that doesn't work in that marketing spectrum.
One thing I loved that we did when I was working in the roasting sphere years ago is we'd always bring in coffees from other roasters. People that might have had the same lots to see what they would do with them. Coffee from other roasters we respected, that we knew were putting out good product. Coffee that we were curious based on how someone was describing and marketing a coffee. Right. That 71 Capri with vinyl seats. What does that mean? Okay, let's taste it. Let's see. Even beyond that, just the opportunity to sit as a sensory judge for barista competitions or Brewers Cup, is also a fantastic way to come up, become calibrated, and get to taste and sort of classify a bunch of really progressive coffees, made by these companies, best people in a really competitive environment, to sort of expand, the number of sensory data points that you can pull from. I mean, all that stuff is really, really invaluable. Yeah, I guess, to kind of put a wrap on it, what did we miss, Mark? I mean, do you feel like we've left this incomplete in any way?
Well, I mean, just briefly, I always had a hard time with the concept of production cupping, in the sense of a cupping, coffee that you've roasted for production in a traditional cupping bowl and spoon and all that, especially when you get into things like dark roast, where if you've ever cupped a dark roast coffee in the bowl, it's just mud. I mean, there's nothing to evaluate. It's very hard in that medium to do that. And so for me, production-wise, I always went to brewing as a way of evaluating. A, that's how my customers experienced the product. And B, I could test that product in a number of ways right there on the fly. I mean, if I brewed in French presses, or if I brewed, using pour overs, I can take some of that liquid and add cream and sugar to it. I could add just cream. I could taste it black and say, okay, in these formats, this is what works, this is what doesn't. And it allowed me to recommend also, this is a great coffee with, say, cream and sugar, or this is a coffee if you are a cream and sugar person and you want to try it without, give it a whirl on this coffee. But you won't know that unless you play with that coffee. So I have always been a fan of production brewing, not necessarily production cupping.
You've been listening to The X-Files, revisiting, rewinding, reworking episodes of the Exchange Coffee podcast from the past, hosted by Mark Inman and Todd Mackey, and produced by me, Mike Ferguson. Our free use opening theme for this episode was X-Files UK Drum Beat by Ronnie Drake. Our closing theme is Coffee Shop Acoustic Funk by Nick Panic. Black Coffee is performed by the one and only Ella Fitzgerald. Remember, you can always email me at mike.ferguson@kavoya.com.
But super juicy, crushable, sweet. It's fantastic.